Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming back to testify again. You've had a long afternoon. I think you ought to do it more often. I mean, while you've been here, we managed to negotiate a successful preliminary agreement with the European Union. You managed to issue a declaration supporting what many of us have been hoping to see with regard to Crimea. And there was a third thing that happened, and I don't know if it's good or bad, but my understanding is the White House has decided to postpone the visit of President Putin until after the first of the year.
When I left my business, it began to succeed as well, so I'll come down here.
I think they wait until you're gone before they make all these decisions. No. I want to comment briefly on what you responded to with Senator Coons on what tools could we use with regard to pushing back on some of the interference in other countries' elections. I'd hope that you would say the Global Engagement Center, because it's a tool you have. And frankly, although Senator Murphy and I wrote legislation to give you the authority to do it, you have more aggressively used that tool, both by providing funding for it and now hiring the right people than your predecessors. And it's precisely this sort of situation. I will give you the recent example, I think it's very important, which is what's going on with Macedonia. You know, as they go for their referendum to be part of Europe, these European integration efforts tend to be a place where the Russians see an opportunity and engage in significant disinformation. Great opportunity for us to push back in the appropriate way through the Global Engagement Center. And would you confirm to me that you thought about that and you will think about that in the future?
Yes, of course. May I add one thing that I think you'll find interesting? When I was with my Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, he's very aware of the Global Engagement Center.
Should be. I mean,
he raised the issue with me.
Yeah.
When I met with him, I think it was when I met with him in person. It may have been in a conversation by phone, but in my last interaction with him, he raised the issue.
as compared to the resources the Russians put into their efforts, it is minuscule, as you know, but it is significant. And I think it'll be done professionally, thanks to some of the work you've done, and I applaud you for that. We discussed at your confirmation hearing in April the need for us to focus more on Central Eastern Europe, specifically Ukraine. I'd just come back from a trip to Ukraine. I'd been out in the contact line in April where there's a hot conflict going on. I mean, where there are people dying. And it is, when you go there, pretty moving because you see how the Ukrainians have had to defend themselves and their territorial integrity really for the last 4 years against Russian aggression. And I believe, I think you do, that a successful pro-Western Ukraine is not only critical to the region, but I think it's the best antidote to Russian expansion in the region. Along those lines, I want to commend you for last week releasing the $200 million in military assistance. This goes for equipment, training, other assistance. And I think we have not taken enough credit for what happened, which is we told the Ukrainians, you need to make reforms. And when I was there in April, I talked to President Poroshenko. I also talked to Speaker Parubey then and again last month about this. In fact, I talked to him the day after they passed these reforms saying, you know, we need to see these reforms to your defense system, frankly getting away from the Russian influence system they had into one that's more consistent with European democracies, having a civilian control of their military, among other things. They did that. You then were able to release the $200 million. That's exactly how it should work, right? So I commend you for that, and I think it's going to make a huge difference. The lethal weapons they now have to defend themselves makes a huge difference. And so the actions sometimes do speak louder than the words, and in those cases, I think it's very important. On the resolution which you issued today with regard to Crimea, I was really happy to read it. I know that many in our community in Ohio who follow this closely are pleased with it. They believe this puts the United States clearly in the position where we will not relieve sanctions until this issue is resolved. And I would ask you today, can you confirm that the Russians have a clear understanding that sanctions related to Crimea will not be able to be reduced or certainly eliminated so long as Crimea remains an issue?
I think they did before this statement, and I'm confident after the statement that the president released, that will reaffirm their understanding.
Do you believe the Russians have a clear understanding that sanctions related to their actions in eastern Ukraine along the border cannot be altered without real implementation of the Minsk agreement and the end to that aggression in Ukraine? There's a lot of talk about new sanctions, as you know, with regard to Russia. And I do support us having a better bilateral relationship with Russia. I think it's important. We're two major nuclear powers. They've got a lot of weapons pointed at us. I also support discussions that are prepared. I think it's very important that our statements, both in private and in public, are clear and consistent. And I think that needs to happen from the president all the way down to our diplomats such as yourself. And again, I think you have done that. I think that was the issue with Helsinki. In addition to what's going on in the eastern border of Ukraine and Crimea, I think there's a clear consensus in the national security community, not just the IC, but the National Security Committee more broadly, about the severity of the short and midterm threat that Russia poses. Its espionage, its cyber, its information capabilities, meddling in the 2016 elections, and now in the 2018 elections. Our intelligence communities seem to have a consensus around that, including you in your previous role. And we have sanctions in place, but they don't seem to be working.
Yeah.
I mean, that long list that I just gave, they don't seem to be working. So let me ask you a question, and this is not an easy one to answer, but one, why aren't they working? Second, do you support new sanctions, specifically related to the new information we have about 2016 and about 2018 interference in our democratic process? And if so, what kind of sanctions would be more effective?
So your point is well taken. There continues, in spite of the work that's been done by this administration, there continues to be Russian malign activity. We have to use sanctions as a tool. You talked about the Global Engagement Center. I think there are many tools that we can use. In my role as a diplomat, we have a handful, and we are working to do what I think it was Senator Rubio at the beginning of this hearing described as raise the cost sufficiently and convince Vladimir Putin that it's not in his best interest to continue this behavior. That's going to be difficult. I know precisely who Vladimir Putin is. I know his history, but that's the task. The task is for us, the U.S. government, that includes you and the executive branch, to raise the costs on Russia sufficiently that they cease this malign activity that adversely impacts the United
And do you
States.
believe new sanctions are appropriate to raise the cost in
I do. I
response
think
to new information we've received?
I do, Senator. If we can find the right places and the right leverage point, the things that will actually make a difference to Russia, I think it would be constructive to head down that path.
And can you tell us what you think might be more effective than the previous sanctions that have not been effective in accomplishing those means?
It's, I don't know that I have a great answer.
Do you think it's
for today.
focusing more on individuals, on oligarchs? Do you think it's focusing more on some of the economic choke points? What's the general?
It would be my judgment that each of those is necessary, that the things that impact the Russian economy are the things that I hear the Russians most concerned about.
Secretary, thank you. I'm glad you're there, and we appreciate your testimony today.